everybody, I'm Joe, and I'm back to start a series of reviews of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, starting off with Jon Favreau's Iron Man from 2008, the one that started it all, and it's going on about 10 years. My God. Where does the time go with these things? I apologize for not getting as much content out as I wanted to. I'll explain it in a future video somehow in the next couple weeks or so, but a lot's been going on in my personal life, and I just haven't really had the energy or the drive to do more videos, but things have quieted down somewhat a little bit for me, and I have a pretty good handle on where I'm going in the next year or so. Anyway, with Avengers Infinity War on the horizon, gives me an excuse to talk about some of the MCU flicks. Now, I've done other videos on the MCU in the past with a tag, reviews of Phase 1 and 2 and so on, but looking back on it, I don't feel fully satisfied with those things, at least the Phase 1, Phase 2 reviews, because I feel like I have a lot more to say in regards to each one, Iron Man 1 being one of them. So let's talk about Jon Favreau's Iron Man, released in 2008, and the one that really propelled the MCU into what it is right now. In regards to my history with this movie, I didn't know anything about the character of Iron Man. I may have heard his name mentioned once or twice, but as with a lot of comic book characters, I didn't read a single Iron Man comic. The only thing with Iron Man that I've read a comic about is when Spider-Man first meets him along with the Avengers from the early 60s comics of Spider-Man. But I didn't know anything about Iron Man, and I don't know a whole ton about his lore and what his deal is, but seeing the trailers back in 2008, I wasn't really impressed. And Robert Downey Jr. being cast as Iron Man, at that time he had faced a lot of problems with his drug addiction, and I just kind of saw him as one of those nutcase actors that fell off the grid after a while. And I didn't see it in theaters when it came out because The Dark Knight was the one that I was really excited for, which I'll talk about in a future video, but it took me a couple of viewings of it on Blu-ray about 2 years later to actually appreciate it. It was right around the time of the second Iron Man being released, and I went back and watched the first Iron Man, and I thought, wow, wow, this is a really good movie. Because at first I didn't really appreciate it. It was one of those situations like Star Trek 09. The more I watched it, the more I grew to like it. And I'm probably going to reiterate more or less some of the same points that people have made over the last 10 years, but hopefully I can provide an original experience for you all, because I'm not a huge comic book aficionado, but I would say that Iron Man is one of my favorite, if not my favorite Avenger in the MCU. Cap's my favorite, but Iron Man, he's somewhere up there in the top. And considering that he was basically a C-lister before this movie, and how Marvel managed to make him one of their A-listers, you gotta give credit where it's due. I mean, you could say whatever you want about Marvel and some of the choices they made with their movies, but the fact that Iron Man is very relevant in pop culture 10 years later after this movie, huge props to them. Especially Kevin Feige and Robert Downey Jr. and Jon Favreau and everybody else involved. And the filmmakers, I think, made a really wise choice. Rather than trying to get everyone familiar with the Iron Man lore, it basically introduced the general public to the character of Iron Man, but also spent a lot of time getting us into the psyche of Tony Stark, played by Robert Downey Jr. When you first meet Tony Stark, he's pretty much what you expect as a genius, billionaire, playboy, philanthropist, as he later calls himself in the Avengers. Pretty arrogant, pretty cocky, and narcissistic. May come off as a little bit uncaring, but it's pretty clear in the first act of the movie that he doesn't really have any ill intentions in his heart. He owns a weapons company called Stark Industries, named after his father Howard, and his company builds weapons of war to give to the United States military in order to scare their enemies into submission. At this point, he doesn't fully understand the impact that his weapons are having, but he's in the viewpoint that it's a necessary evil in order to do what has to be done. There's no ill intentions, he just knows that war is war and you gotta do what you gotta do. But it's not until when he's in a convoy of US airmen that they're attacked by a group of insurgents called the Ten Rings that he's kidnapped and suffers a severe injury where he has a car battery of sorts built by this man named Yinsen in order to keep him alive from keeping the shrapnel from entering his heart and killing him. The Ten Rings give him an ultimatum: to build a missile for us, otherwise you're gone. Now, what makes the first Iron Man a really good movie? Well, I think the biggest thing is its leading actor, Robert Downey Jr. He is one of the best actors in the business, no question. From what I understand, Iron Man isn't exactly the way he's portrayed in the films. He's got a sense of humor, but he's a lot more cynical, more downbeat, and more serious, even more so than Bruce Wayne is in the Batman comics, almost to the point where it's a little bit unbearable to sit through. And I think it was a wise decision on the filmmaker's part to make him a bit more sarcastic and witty, because I think you can make that kind of character likable, the Iron Man from the comics, but it's really easy to make that unsympathetic. And while you could say that it's basically Robert Downey Jr. playing a variation of himself as he's done before in his other films, I've never really had much of a problem with it. And from what I can tell, Iron Man fans and comic book fans, they couldn't care less either, because he finds the right balance of making the character likable while also balancing his sarcasm and his wit. And he's not the usual type of superhero protagonist with a tragic backstory like Spider-Man or Batman. He does have some tragedy, yes, as it's further expanded upon in future MCU sequels, but what really his motivation is for becoming Iron Man is his desire to clean up his own messes, which is what makes this movie stand apart from your usual origin superhero stories. And they show throughout the movie that he's a man who has it all, with his riches, his nice mansion, and his big company. He has all these women and these nice cars and whatnot, yet at the same time, he doesn't have anything. His parents are dead, and the only thing he has is his assistant, Pepper Potts, played by Gwyneth Paltrow. And this is touched upon by the character Yinsen as they're in the cave building the makeshift Iron Man suit. And once Tony manages to form the makeshift suit and escape, he manages to have some final words with Yinsen, who's fatally wounded, who tells him,
"Don't waste it. Don't waste your life."
And it's a scene that, looking back on it, I think it's very impactful, having seen the other MCU flicks, that he finally manages to find some meaning and purpose for living his life. So he's later found and rescued by the US military, returned to his home in California, and after seeing what happened during his captivity, he announces to the world that he's going to cancel all of his weapons programs, much to the chagrin of his company, including Obadiah Stane, who worked with his father Howard Stark. And as far as the other actors and characters, you got Rhodey, played by Terrence Howard, Obadiah, played by Jeff Bridges, Pepper Potts, played by Gwyneth Paltrow, and you also got Jarvis, voiced by Paul Bettany, who later becomes Vision in Avengers Age of Ultron. I like the relationship between Pepper and Tony because it's not the cliched, usual romances that you see in a superhero flick. It's pretty clear from the get-go that they have feelings for each other, but they do it very subtly. It's not so obvious. And there's also a really cool thing that they did by having them ad-lib their dialogue while also keeping a sense of structure throughout certain scenes. Like when Pepper helps Tony replace the arc reactor in his chest, there's a sense of tension and fear that she might have screwed it up and killed him, but they also find a nice balance of fear and dread along with comic relief at the same time. And I know that Gwyneth Paltrow was listed as one of the most hated celebrities in the business, and she's also listed as one of the most pretentious famous people to ever walk this earth. I don't really care because she's nice to look at. But I think she's really good in this role. I think she's a little too overbearing in the sequels, but I'll save that for another time. But in this one, I like the relationship between her and Tony because, as I said, it's very subtle, and I think it also plays into the theme that this movie touches upon, having a heart. As far as Terrence Howard as Rhodey, he's fine. And I know it's easy for me to say that because I'm used to Don Cheadle by now, but I think Don Cheadle was a much better choice in the long run. And usually, recastings in movies, I don't really like them because they're too distracting, similar to Maggie Gyllenhaal and Katie Holmes in the Dark Knight trilogy. On the other hand, you gotta love Jeff Bridges as Obadiah Stane. He's got a very smooth talker kind of vibe to him. And it's no surprise coming from me, but Jeff Bridges I think is one of the best actors we've ever seen. And he's got some really cool lines in here too, such as,
"Tony Stark was able to build this in a cave with a box of scraps."
Always makes me go like this. Okay. On the other hand, though, this is one of my negatives with the first Iron Man. His endgame isn't exactly clear by the third act. The first two acts, I think it's fine because it's very subtle and you don't exactly know if this guy is genuine about wanting to help Tony or if he's got something else up his sleeve. By the time it's revealed that he is the bad guy and he's the one that paid the 10 rings to kidnap Tony and kill him, I would buy that he would want to take over Stark Industries and use it for its own benefit, but his reasons for wanting to build a similar suit that Tony has, it's not exactly clear what his motivation was in that area. But at the same time, I can let it slide, because everything else I think is very solidly executed. And Jarvis, voiced by Paul Bettany, the interactions between Jarvis and Tony make for some of the best comedic moments. Jarvis, sometimes you gotta run before you can walk. Speaking of the humor, you obviously got a lot of great one-liners from Robert Downey Jr., such as the scenes with him and Pepper Potts, but then there's instances where he's testing out his flying technology.
2, 1.
And lines like this.
"If you douse me again, and I'm not on fire, I'm donating you to City College."
And I guarantee you that a lot of those lines were improv or ad-libbed, and Jon Favreau decided, yeah, let's keep that. That works. And another one of my favorite funny moments is this.
Let's face it, this is not the worst thing you've caught me doing.
Perfect way to lighten up an awkward situation. Now let's talk a little bit about Tony developing his technology. It's a similar fashion that Batman Begins has, where we see Bruce Wayne developing his tech as Batman. Despite being a billionaire, it's established throughout the movie that Tony Stark's a pretty intelligent guy. There's a lot of time dedicated to seeing how he develops his tech throughout the second act. testing his ability to hover in the air with his flying technology, using a prototype suit to fly high in the sky to the point where his suit starts to freeze. It's one of those things where it makes you feel like you're going on a journey with Tony Stark, and you start to feel smart like he is. Now, you could argue that it's not exactly accurate as far as technology and science is concerned, but movies are escapism, so yes, there's going to be leaps in logic, but in a way you feel like you've gotten to the level of intelligence that Tony is on when you finally see him perfect this technology. And one thing that I really like that this movie does, as many people have pointed out, rather instead of stopping random crimes on the street, once he discovers that his company is dealing under the table, selling his weapons to terrorist groups like the Ten Rings in Golmyra, which is where he was being held, he decides to take initiative and clean up his own mess. As opposed to someone like Spider-Man or Batman who experience a personal tragedy from a random criminal, and then they decide to use their powers to stop similar criminals like that, Tony Stark actually sees his consequences of his actions, takes responsibility for it, and cleans up his own mess. Which leads into the scene where he flies to Golmyra in his Iron Man suit and takes out the Ten Rings storming the village. Now, there's been some talk about whether or not this is actually justifiable since he's technically killing people, but think about it. This is an active war zone. People die in war. And when you're put into that situation, you either gotta kill or be killed. What other option are you gonna take? Surrender? Well, with these guys, the odds of that, very low. So I don't really mind the fact that he's killing these guys in order to save these villagers because, like I said, it's an active war zone, and they're also using his weapons for their own agenda. So what else are you gonna do? And the Iron Man suit looks great. I mean, we've all seen various versions of the Iron Man suit in the MCU, and there were only a small handful of times that Robert Downey Jr. was actually wearing a suit. Most of the time now, he just wears a mocap suit. But even then, watching this movie now, 10 years later, the special effects don't even seem dated in the slightest. I buy that that's an actual suit when it's walking around on screen. And the action sequences are pretty well done too. There's not a whole ton in here as I remember. It's mostly towards the third act or at the climax of the movie. And this is a little random, but my favorite shot in this whole film is this. It's just the perfect kind of badassery that you would want in an Iron Man moment. And then later on we get to my favorite scene, where Pepper tries to talk Tony out of his Iron Man endeavors by threatening to quit her job. And Tony doesn't like that when he says, "For all these years you stood by my side while I reaped the benefits of destruction, and now I'm trying to protect the people I put in harm's way. You're gonna walk out?" And she tells him, "You're gonna kill yourself. I don't want any part of this." But then he responds with this.
"I just finally know what I have to do. And I know in my heart that it's right."
I think it's at this point where his arc is finally complete in this film. But as I mentioned earlier with the thing about hearts, this scene I think is a perfect showcase that he really is a compassionate person who does care about people, especially since he now knows what his purpose is in his life. So she relents and decides to help him out and discovers what Obadiah was up to by hiring the Ten Rings to kidnap Tony and kill him, which she later meets up with Agent Coulson with S.H.I.E.L.D. to inform him of the situation, which I almost forgot that Agent Coulson shows up in this movie. And what I really like about Agent Coulson in Phase 1, and he's not the typical dirtbag government agent. It shows throughout the other movies that he does have a good heart underneath, especially with the whole trading cards thing with Captain America, which we'll talk about in a future review with the Avengers. Can't wait to talk about that. When Obadiah realizes that his intentions have been discovered, he steals Tony's arc reactor and uses it for his own Ironmonger suit, which leads into the climactic fight between him and Iron Man. This fight isn't the greatest action sequence that I've seen, and it kind of falls into that typical superhero climactic battle tropes that you would usually see in something like this. I didn't really care because, like I said, of how all the other stuff was so well done. And it's also got some pretty quotable lines by Jeff Bridges. "Impressive! You've upgraded your armor! I've made some upgrades of my own!" And then there's this.
Oh, still, you little prick.
Only Jeff Bridges could get away with saying something like that in the MCU. So with the help of Pepper Potts, Tony manages to defeat Iron Man in the arc reactor explosion, essentially killing him. And then the next day at the end of the movie, people are starting to ask questions on who this Iron Man fellow is and what is his connection to Stark Industries. And Tony Stark is told to just read the official statement that he was away and that the Iron Man was just a bodyguard, that he's not Iron Man, and so on. But instead of saying that, he does this.
I am Iron Man.
I still remember the first time I watched it, even when I didn't fully appreciate the movie, it made me go, whoa! It's another example of what makes this movie stand out from other superhero origin stories. Rather than the protagonist trying to keep his identity a secret, he flat out says to the public that, yeah, it's me, I am the superhero. Because I think it would be kind of pointless to try to use a cover story. It's too obvious. The guy's Iron Man. I mean, who else would be able to afford that stuff? But they don't try to explain it that often in movies, so most of the time you can let it slide. But in this case, I think it was a wiser choice to have Tony Stark say, yeah, I'm Iron Man. And as with every Marvel movie, there's a scene during the credits. But in this case, it's a post-credit scene where Tony returns home and he sees Nick Fury standing in the living room of his house, where he says,
I'm here to talk to you about the Avenger Initiative.
and thus a new era was born. Who would have thought that this would lead to the Avengers? I don't think anybody did, including me. Watching this movie last night, it's really refreshing to see how it's not so focused on setting up future sequels to justify why it's there in the first place. It's more focused on telling its own story. And having seen the other MCU flicks, I think it made the whole experience even better, knowing what happens to Tony Stark in other films. Overall, despite the fact that it kind of suffers from some similar problems that the other MCU flicks have with its villains, I think this is a really solid movie and one of the best superhero films ever made. Just about everything with this movie worked. So those are my thoughts on the first Iron Man movie. Let me know down below what your thoughts are on the first Iron Man. Love it, like it, think it's alright, or do you dislike it or really hate it? Whatever the case is, with MCU haters these days, I'm prepared. I really don't get fazed by that stuff anymore, but anyway, let me know down below what your thoughts are, and stay tuned for more standalone MCU reviews. I think my next one just might be the first Avengers movie. Looking forward to talking about that one. And I cannot wait for Infinity Wars. That looks like it's going to be a lot of fun, especially seeing how the MCU has built up over the last 10 years. Thank you guys for watching my video. Again, stay tuned for more reviews, and I will see you guys next time.